Our speaker today is Stephen Coss, who will explain why the year 1721 was key to American history and the history of medicine. The title of his speech is The Fever of 1712, the epidemic that revolutionized medicine and American politics. He is from Connecticut, but has been in Madison for the past 20 years and earned his bachelor's degree in journalism from Temple University in Philadelphia. When he isn't researching or writing history, Stephen works at a freelance advertising and marketing communications copywriter and also serves as a Wisconsin election official. We look forward to your presentation today, Stephen, and we have made a contribution to the Rotary International Polio Plus Fund as a way to say thank you for speaking to us. As we welcome him to the podium, I want to remind you that if time permits, there will be questions at the end, and someone will be in the audience with a microphone for that. So please welcome Stephen Coss.
Thank you very much. I'm honored to be here, especially since it's Michelle's first meeting. I'll try not to put a damper on that as best I can. I'm talking about smallpox, so there's that. And you know, it is hard to get the date right. In fact, that leads wonderfully right into what's going to be my first point. And this applies to everyone except Stu Levitan, because Stu had me on his show to talk about the book, so he's going to be perhaps the one person in this room what I'm about to say does not apply to. Other than Stu, I'm going to go out on a limb here, and I'm going to assert unequivocally that if I met you on the street outside this building and asked you out of the clear blue sky to name a key year from early American history or from the run-up to the American Revolution, you would not say 1721. You might think of the Jamestown founding, the Jamestown colony in 1607, of Plymouth in 1620. You might think of the pre-revolution events like the Boston Massacre in 1770 or the Tea Party in 1773. And of course, it would be a slam dunk that everybody would say July 4th, 1776, the date we just celebrated. So that begs the question, what's so special about 1721? And why did I dedicate 7 years of research and writing to producing a book about it? And actually, that's a question my wife asked several times in the course of those 7 years. But I'm going to try to answer it better today than I did then. Okay, so let's talk about the importance of 1721. In a nutshell, there are 4 things that make 1721 way more significant than any of us, including me, would have thought before I did all the work. The first thing is, in 1721, I should say 1721 marked the very beginning of what would become the Patriot movement. That effort was led by a remarkable man almost no one has heard of, but I'm going to tell you more about in a minute. Second, 1721 marked the launch of the first independent newspaper in America. And not only was it the first independent newspaper, but it was the first newspaper or document of any kind to argue that there ought to be freedom of the press. Third, 1721 gave us the first large-scale inoculation experiment in Western medicine. The success of that experiment was profound because it marked the beginning of the end of smallpox, which was, at the time, the world's deadliest disease. And last, but by no means least, 1721 proved the most important and formative year in the life of one of our favorite founding fathers, who was then a young Boston printer's apprentice named Benjamin Franklin. The catalyst for all of these important developments was a smallpox epidemic that hit this town, Boston, in 1721. And for the next several minutes, I'd like to tell you a little more about the year 1721 and each of the points I just enumerated. So since this is a political year, let's start with politics. You might or might not be aware that the American Revolution was not the first armed rebellion against English authority in the colonies. In 1689, the people of Massachusetts, of the Massachusetts colony, banded together and overthrew an especially tyrannical royal governor named Edmund Andros. This is an artist's depiction of Andros being escorted out of Boston. By 1721, there had been other similar uprisings in Virginia, New York, and Carolina. What those rebellions had in common, besides violence or the threat of violence, was that they were focused on very specific objectionable people or objectionable policies. In Massachusetts, for example, the people were not questioning England's right to impose a royal governor or to dictate policy through him. They were simply saying that this particular royal governor was a very bad guy. He had abused his powers, and they wanted him out. What happened in 1721 was different. In 1721, Massachusetts staged a nonviolent political rebellion that for the first time, challenged the idea, previously accepted and not questioned, that England could or should control the colony. And it all started with this man, Elisha Cooke Jr. Cooke was a Boston businessman who came from a prominent political family. In fact, his father had been involved in the overthrow of Edmund Andros. His father had been, like his father, Elisha Cooke was what was considered an old charter man. When Massachusetts was founded, the original charter gave the people of Massachusetts the right to pick their own governor and make their own laws, pretty much without interference. It was an enormous amount of autonomy. In 1686, England took away that charter and replaced it with what was called the New Charter. And the New Charter gave the right to choose the governor back to England and gave England veto powers over all the laws that were made in Massachusetts. Elisha Cooke despised the New Charter. He despised any attempt by England, way before the Revolution, despised any attempt by England to impose policy on the colonies, or on Massachusetts. More than half a century before the American Revolution, he was determined that Massachusetts ought to be, in effect, if not by formal declaration, independent of British authority. He was in his 30s when he was first elected to the Massachusetts legislature in 1719, and he wasted no time building and consolidating his power. He reached beyond Boston to the Netherlands of Massachusetts to get support from politicians in smaller villages and towns. And he also did what no one had thought to do before. Within Boston, he got people who had the vote but never exercised it to become involved in the political process. Believe it or not, that was a problem then, as it is today. He did this by force of his charisma. He was a wonderful, dynamic speech maker, and he also did it by buying a lot of free drinks. Part of Elisha Cooke's business interests included owning a number of taverns, and so the booze flowed freely. All of those things together allowed Cooke to form what was essentially the first urban political machine in America. And that machine would become known and become famous as the Boston Caucus. By 1721, Cooke had so much power that the royal governor, Samuel Shute was his name, the royal governor basically had lost almost all control. The House, that he was the head of the House of Representatives, the House could basically obstruct anything the royal governor tried to put through or that England tried to get him to put through. The governor, Samuel Shute, became so desperate, in fact, that when smallpox came to Boston in 1721, he basically took the House of Representatives hostage. He called them into session in an infected part of Boston and held them there, trying to coerce their cooperation on threat of smallpox. He failed, despite the danger, which did claim the life of a very popular Boston politician. The House refused to capitulate. The death of that House member, in fact, and the cruelty of Shute's tactic was really the end of Shute's, whatever effectiveness he had left was over once that happened. He'd already lost the political support. Now he lost the support of the people. By 1722, he was basically a lame duck. And by the end of that year, he snuck out of Boston on a British warship, went back to London, and never returned. Elisha Cooke and his party made similar work of his successors. Several royal governors came and went. In fact, one became ill in office when he was in office and died, and people said that he died of exasperation. What was important about this was that Cooke's success showed not only Massachusetts, but the other colonies, that it was possible to mount a successful and a sustained political resistance to English domination. But actually, he had an even more direct influence on what would become an all-out revolution during the American Revolution. By the 1730s, Cooke's organization was very large, and he had several lieutenants. And on a regular basis, he would go to the home of one of those lieutenants, where he and the lieutenant would talk politics and talk strategy and how to bedevil whichever poor SOB happened to have the governor's office at that point in time. While they talked, the son of this lieutenant would sit at their feet, like kids are wont to do, and the kid would soak it all in, listen to what they had to say. Many years later, that boy became this man, Samuel Adams. The lieutenant was Samuel Adams Sr., known as the Deacon. The firebrand of the American Revolution, the Sam Adams we all know from the Revolution and from beer, is Samuel Adams Jr. Sam Adams and his fellow patriots got a lot of their political ideas and their tactics and their attitude from Elisha Cooke. But just as important, they got his caucus. The caucus gave them a mechanism and an infrastructure to counter British attempts to force policy on the colony. The caucus would live on, would grow, would split into several caucuses by the eve of the Revolution. It would spin off the Sons of Liberty. It would spin off the Committees of Correspondence, and of course, they would actually help launch the American Revolution. But it all started in 1721 with Elisha Cooke, who, in my book, is our founding grandfather. In 1721, I should say prior to 1721, there were 3 newspapers in America, 2 in Boston and 1 in Philadelphia. Here is one of the Boston papers, the Boston Newsletter. And this is the other one, a photocopy of the other one, the Boston Gazette. You'll notice, you probably didn't have time to see the first one, but both of them say published by authority at the top. What that phrase meant, what that phrase was a promise to the government that they would do nothing to offend it, that was their promise of allegiance. Newspapers were not supposed to cause trouble, they were supposed to be a function of the government. And then in 1721, a young man named James Franklin came along and introduced this newspaper, the New England Courant. You'll notice it does not say published by authority. And that was not an oversight, that was intentional. James Franklin had returned to Boston from a printer's apprenticeship in London a few years earlier, and he had wanted right from the start to start a newspaper and to do something more dynamic and more compelling and more challenging than these papers. The problem was, well, twofold. The first problem was that both of these papers were very unprofitable, so there wasn't a whole lot of profit incentive to do this. And James's printing business was even less profitable than the newspapers were. In fact, when he'd come back from London, his father, Josiah Franklin, tried to talk him out of starting his own business. He wanted him to bide his time, work for someone else, maybe relocate somewhere else where there was a need. But James was very confident, a little arrogant, and he was not going to take no for an answer. Finally, his father agreed to loan him the money to start a business on one condition, and this would become a famous condition. That condition was that James Franklin had to take his little brother, Ben Franklin, on as his apprentice. Ben and James went into business in 1718 when James was 21 and Benjamin was all of 12 years old. This is an artist's depiction of what their shop might have looked like. That would probably be James on the left setting type, Ben working the press because he was always stronger and more hardy than his brother. The man on the right would have been a journeyman printer that they would hire when they had a particular need for that. But as I alluded to previously, there was no need for that because their business was terrible. Their father had been right. Fathers are often right. There wasn't enough business in Boston to sustain another print shop, and so the Franklin brothers struggled for several years. Then in 1721, James got the break he needed, and it came, ironically enough, from the smallpox epidemic. The Boston smallpox epidemic of 1721, as I mentioned in my opening, led to the inoculation experiment, which I'll talk more about in a minute, actually. The inoculation experiment produced an enormous controversy. Some people supported inoculation, but many, many more people opposed inoculation. James Franklin, being at heart a very savvy businessman, realized that he could exploit the controversy over inoculation to start his newspaper, providing it took an anti-inoculation, a popular anti-inoculation position. So in August 1721, he began publishing the New England Courant. Here's another look at that. And indeed, for the first few weeks, the Courant sold lots of copies by doing exactly what James planned, by attacking inoculation. But James was really agnostic over inoculation. It was more of an opportunistic thing with him than it was a real conviction. So within about 5 weeks of starting the paper, he began to turn his attention to other subjects that he found more compelling. And those subjects were politics, philosophy, social issues. And he also wanted to write about more lighthearted things like the trials and tribulations of love and marriage. Create a paper that people would actually want to read. In fact, his most popular content, which would come along a little later, was a series of essays that, now mind you, this is in Puritan Boston in 1720s, a series of essays that poked fun at religion, that poked fun at drunkenness, that poked fun at prostitution. Those essays came from a mysterious contributor who started dropping her offerings off at the door of the printing house. She called herself Silence Dogood. I don't know if you can read it, but at the bottom lower right of that front page, you'll see Silence Dogood. That's one of the Silence Dogood issues. In reality, Silence Dogood was Ben Franklin. James didn't know this, and it wasn't a good thing when he found out. And you have to read my book to find out what happened then. James wanted a paper that was topical and literate and funny and edgy, and his Courant did all those things. It did many things no newspaper had ever done before. But the most significant thing it did historically is it actually argued that a newspaper ought to have the right, the liberty to criticize authority. This was a radical idea in 1721. English newspapers that dared cross the government were routinely charged with seditious libel. And whereas nowadays, we say, well, truth is a defense against libel, that was not true then. In fact, the opposite was true. The more true it was, the more the government got annoyed, and the worse it came down on people. The adage was, the greater the truth, the greater the libel. So as you can imagine, James Franklin's insistence on not only advocating freedom of the press, but trying to exercise it, ruffled a few feathers in Boston. And in time, it actually got him thrown in jail. So James Franklin, and when he did get thrown in jail, guess who took over the newspaper? Ben Franklin. 16 years old, he took over the most radical paper in America. Most people don't even know that about Ben Franklin. The point, I guess, is, as far as James goes, is that although he did not succeed in getting the government to accept freedom of the press, he planted the seed. And that seed would grow for the rest of the 18th century. Through the trial of John Peter Zenger in 1735, which I believe was affected by James Franklin's experience, until 70 years after James Franklin first proposed in print that there ought to be freedom of the press, at least in his colony, it became enshrined as the First Amendment of the Constitution. And there's the Bill of Rights. Okay, as I mentioned earlier, 1721 marked the beginning of the end of smallpox, which was the deadliest disease in history. This photo will give you an idea of just how bad it was. And there are way more disturbing photos, but in deference to this being a luncheon, I thought this would suffice. Prior to 1721, doctors in Europe and America really had no way of preventing smallpox, and really no way of effectively treating smallpox for that matter either. But when it came to Boston in 1721, the epidemic started up in the spring, got worse in the summer. There was one man who believed he actually had stumbled upon an answer, and this is the man. somewhere. I think this was so horrible it froze the machine. No, I guess not. There he is. Cotton Mather. The suspense is over. If you know the name Cotton Mather at all, it's almost certainly in connection with something that had nothing to do with this. Anybody want to venture what that is? Cotton Mather? Salem witch trials. It had been nearly 30 years at this point since the Salem witch trials, and Mather had spent almost that entire time trying to redeem his reputation. Where, as you know, he was involved, although tangentially to the trials, he took a lot of the blame, and the trials resulted in the execution of 20 people falsely accused of witchcraft. In that attempt to change his reputation, he'd thrown himself into the study of science and of medicine as an offshoot of that. And in his study of medicine, he'd accidentally stumbled upon two different accounts of something called inoculation or variolation. One account was from Constantinople. The other account came from the African slave owned by his family. Mather had a slave he had named Onesimus. And one day, while having a conversation with Onesimus explained the reason for the scar on his arm. He told Mather that in Africa, when smallpox came into a village, they would take smallpox from someone who was infected already, and they would implant it in an incision made in the arm of someone who had never had the disease. The person would get a little sick, but not nearly as sick as you'd get by naturally acquired smallpox. And then after a short illness, that person would recover without permanent after effect and would be forever immune from smallpox. To Cotton Mather's great credit, and I don't know how many more men in Boston we can say this about, to Cotton Mather's great credit, he believed Onesimus. In fact, he was so confident in what his slave told him that when smallpox broke out in 1721, he went to the doctors of Boston and urged them, he told them about the story and urged them to try inoculation. Every single one ignored him. Partly it was because this was so counterintuitive. He was asking people he was saying, give somebody smallpox to keep them from dying from smallpox. So you can understand that part of it. But there was also a lot of Western and a lot of racial arrogance involved here too. These doctors who'd grown up in the Western tradition of medicine couldn't comprehend or couldn't even allow for the possibility that there was actually something from Constantinople or, God forbid, Africa that was effective and they hadn't already heard about. But Mather persisted and eventually convinced one doctor to give it a try. His name was Zabdiel Boylston. And the reason Boylston gave it a try when no one else would was partly because of his upbringing. He'd grown up in the countryside outside of Boston. His father had been a doctor. Both he and his father had regular interaction with Indians who lived in the countryside. And his father got to know and understand and appreciate Native American medicine and some of the cures that were frankly superior to what Western medicine could offer. So Boylston was predisposed to accept the possibility, at least, that there were ideas outside his tradition that had value. Boylston was also uncommonly daring. A few years before the 1721 outbreak, he'd been called to tend to a woman who was believed to be dying of breast cancer. Most doctors at that time would have made her as comfortable as they could and been resigned to the inevitable death. Boylston didn't do that. Boylston surgically removed the diseased breast. It was the first recorded mastectomy in American medical history. And this was at a time when it was never done in England. It was done a little bit in other parts of Europe. But it was an incredibly bold thing to do. But that was Boylston. And in fact, on June 26, 1721, he took the plunge with inoculation. He inoculated 3 people that day, including his own 6-year-old son. Mostly, I think, because he realized he couldn't ask other people to trust a procedure he wouldn't trust on his own children. Those succeeded. Other inoculations succeeded. Inoculation began to become more successful, but it was also encountering more violent opposition among people who claimed, among other things, that inoculation was just spreading smallpox. It wasn't actually preventing smallpox. But despite the harassment, despite vandalism against his property, despite death threats that caused him to go into hiding, he continued inoculating. And by the end of the epidemic, he'd inoculated about 280 people. when he finished the inoculation experiment, he wrote a book, and this is the cover of the book. That book was really important because it detailed in great specificity what he had done and what he had accomplished. And between his own personal testimony and that book, inoculation began to gather some momentum, both in the colonies and in England. And it would continue to gain momentum right up until the very end of the 18th century, when an English doctor named Jenner performed another inoculation, but a little different. What he did was, instead of using smallpox to inoculate, he used cowpox. The reason vaccination is called vaccination is because vacca is Latin for cow. And of course, vaccination was a profound leap in medical advancements. In 1979, smallpox was eradicated. That was the first time in medical history a major disease had been eradicated by science. And vaccination remains today, and probably always will be, one of the greatest medical accomplishments in the history of medicine. One of the earliest and most vocal supporters of inoculation in America was someone who, as a young man, had witnessed this inoculation experiment firsthand and had a front row seat for all of this stuff. Not only inoculation, but Elisha Cooke's resistance to England, his brother's daring freedom of the press attempt, and of course, you've already figured out, I think, that that's Benjamin Franklin. In the book, I go into great detail about how Benjamin Franklin was affected by all of this. And in fact, I think it did have a profound effect on his view of politics, on his view of science, on his view of experimentation, even on his attitude toward diplomacy, because his brother lacked diplomacy entirely, and he saw what happened to him. I say that everything Ben Franklin really needed to know, he learned in 1721. Slight exaggeration, but I think it's in some way it's essentially true. So in closing, I'd like to touch upon just one of the many things that Ben Franklin took away from that fateful year. It's something that ties him directly to all of you. And you may be aware of this and you may not. Back in 1710, Cotton Mather wrote a book in which he attempted to redefine what it meant to be a leader in one's community. That book was called Bonifacius, Essays Upon the Good. And it argued that wealth and political power, which were the traditional markers of leadership and influence, actually meant less than public service. What distinguished true leaders, Mather wrote, was their commitment to doing good for their neighbors. By 1721, Ben Franklin, who was a voracious reader, self-educated famously, Ben Franklin had read Mather's book by 1721, and in 1721, he saw that in trying to save Boston from smallpox, Mather was practicing what he preached. He was doing good for his community. And Franklin was profoundly affected by this realization. So much so that a few years later, after he'd left Boston and moved to Philadelphia and established himself there, one of the first things he did was create a group he called the Junto, whose members met once a week for two purposes. One purpose was to assist each other professionally. The other was to discuss ways to be of service to their community. The Junto was, in a sense, the first Rotary Club. And so you'll be happy to know, if you didn't already, a lot of people know this story, that your membership in the Madison Rotary Club, with its commitment to service above self and the public good over the private good, places you squarely in the tradition of the great Benjamin Franklin. And that is a very fine tradition indeed. Thank you.
It looks like we have a couple minutes for questions, so I know there'll be some people with microphones.
Engagingly written. Of all the anecdotes and episodes that you cover, what are one or two of the events you would most like to have observed yourself?
You know, as famous as Ben Franklin is, he's still an enigma. I would love to have been in any kind of, would love to have been in the room when Ben Franklin told his brother that he was Silence Dogood. Because this, you know, on the one hand, Ben had made his brother's paper very successful, so that was good for both of them. On the other hand, he had hidden all this from his brother, and as an apprentice to a master, you were not supposed to do that. So James was very angry But yeah, I mean, just to understand what really made Ben Franklin tick, one of the things that I enjoyed about writing this book was I got to look at the young Ben Franklin. And when we think of Ben Franklin, I think most of us don't think of the young Ben Franklin. They think of the old kind of doddering guy, of Paris. You know, he had such a long and valuable life that it's easy to forget that he had a childhood. So, and as far as the other thing goes, I suppose anywhere with Cotton Mather. Cotton Mather was such an enigma. I mean, I'd love to have met him and sort of seen him in action.
Warfare with the Native Americans, is that before or after this?
That was after this. I mean, many Native Americans had died from smallpox by this point. In fact, in one part of Massachusetts, much earlier on, because it was, and I'm not talking about Native American, because it was a native population that had never had exposure to this virus before, the death rate was upward of 90%. Those were accidental, or as far as we know, they were accidental contaminations. Because even in the period I'm writing about, people didn't really understand how smallpox was communicated. They understood it was contagious. They had quarantine, but they did not. Germ theory was more than 100 years off in the future. So no, this was all accidental, but it didn't take long, obviously, before people realized that it could be used for more diabolical purposes. Oh, yeah.
You certainly made your case that 1721 was an important year in the history of our country. What exactly did Cotton Mather do in the Salem witch trials? What was his fault?
Well, it's complicated, but basically what he did was enable. Cotton Mather was not a judge. He didn't accuse anybody of witchcraft. He wasn't on the jury, but he was sort of the state's expert witness, if you will. So when these accusations of witchcraft began cropping up, because of a book he'd written about, everybody believed in witches, by the way, at that point. So what he believed in was sort of the norm. What he did, though, he served as an expert witness, and because he was young and wanted to impress the older judges, more powerful men in the colony who were running the show, he basically gave them the go-ahead that they really wanted. And if he had stood up and said, I don't think this is good evidence, it might have made a difference. And in fact, his own father, who was a minister, stood up at one finally and said, this has got to stop. Mather never did, and what happened was he never apologized either, whereas people more intimately involved either died off or did apologize, and so he became sort of by default the symbol of Salem, although, as I say, he had only an indirect connection to it. Yes?
Enjoyed your presentation very much.
Thank you.
A lot of the resistance to England sounds as though it was nonviolent, and that the Continental Army in the 1770s was sort of the culmination of a lot of nonviolence. How much do you think each of the violent and nonviolent, how much of each contributed to the actual separation from England?
I think without question, the nonviolent part was more significant. You know, John Adams, I can't remember the quote John Adams said, but John Adams basically said that the revolution began long before a shot was fired, that there was a change in the minds and the hearts of the people in America. And, throughout, certainly starting this early, but certainly, in the 10 years prior to the beginning of hostilities, that was really when the changes happened. The war, right up until the last minute, I think most Americans, in fact, I'm doing some research on James Otis and Mercy Otis Warren right now, and the Warrens lived in Massachusetts, and they hoped right up until the last minute almost before hostilities broke out that there would be a peaceful resolution. They didn't want to go to war, and they certainly didn't want to go to war against their own people, but it became unavoidable. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Stephen. With that, I know that there are books being sold out in the hallway, but with that, this meeting is adjourned.